Okay, board members, it's 5:30. It's time to call our meeting to order.
Climate change, I don't know.
Our first order is our Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Vice Chair, could you read our mission statement?
The mission of Marshall Public School District is to educate, support, and prepare all learners for success.
Thank you. Approval of the agenda. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Need a second.
I'll second.
Any additions? Hearing none, please vote. It is approved. Public forum. Now is the time the public can approach the board if they have any comments. Moving on to our presentation. Ellers, welcome. We're always excited to hear from you.
Warm drive down. Every time I thought I could move the air conditioning off to the side a little, I started to sweat and had to move it back to blowing. So glad the air is working. It was not working in our office today. So.
Oh, nice.
Good day to be on the road.
Yeah. Okay, well, Deanne just asked us to go through a little bit of an operating referendum overview, just sort of some context background, but then also some very district-specific information that, you know, in a historical perspective on where you're coming from. So that's what I have for you today, and happy to just answer any questions as they come up. So feel free to stop me at any point and just interrupt, and we'll go from there. Okay, so an operating referendum is one of the revenue sources that you can use from your property taxpayers in addition to the general education formula and the other revenue that you get from the state. It is limited, though, through some means through the legislature. So limitations first on when you can go to the voters. You must go to the voters, and you can only go for a November referendum. And there's also a limitation on the per pupil amount that you are allowed to generate. So that number this year, it increases each year with inflation, but that number this year is around $1,970. So we'll see an update of that shortly. If you're a sparsity district, so some of your neighbors, they're allowed to go for an unlimited amount per pupil. So if you see a number higher than around $2,000 per pupil, it's probably because they're a sparsity district and they have that room to go over the cap. That cap was there really so that there is more educational uniformity, so that those districts that can pass quite a bit, maybe those West Metro districts, that their voters continually say yes, don't get over and above what the majority of school districts can access from their voters. So it does come with an equalizing component. And so a lot of school district revenue is equalized. So the basic formula allowance, that comes directly in the form of state aid, but other forms of education revenue have an equalization component like the operating referendum, which really looks to your wealth per pupil and will provide an aid component to that, the rest coming from your levy. So Marshall does qualify for a small levy component of your operating referendum if you were to go and access that additional revenue from your voters. And that's included in the calculations we provided in this presentation as well. Another limitation that the legislature has imposed on this is even if your voters say yes, you have to go back to them every 10 years and re-up that authorization. We have some statistics later on in the presentation to show that most operating referendum revenue renewals are passed at a rate of 100% or over a period of, I think, going back a few years. And you might have heard of some legislation that is floating around that just asks that once an operating referendum is passed, that it would just be reauthorized by the board. So that has not gone into play yet, but I think that statistic really plays through on why that legislation and why you might be hearing about that from maybe MREA or MSBA. So school districts generate revenue on from their taxpayers. They're accessing two different tax bases. The first one is net tax capacity, which most of your levy is spread on. But then also there's referendum market value, and that's what you're generating your local optional revenue on, and equity revenue, transition, which is a very, very small component, but then your operating referendum revenue. And that really goes back to the Ventura days when he had a cabin, didn't want it to pay on his cabin on the operating referendum, so they removed cabins and, more importantly for your community, ag land from that tax base and said, just the businesses and the residents need to generate the revenue to operate the district. But once you receive, following those restrictions, and once you receive that revenue, it is wide open. You can use it for whatever you need it to do for operations. So, and in terms of that restriction, it's very open. So just kind of continuing on in that tax-based discussion, this chart shows on the left-hand column the market value, so what you think of in your district, what your district is made up of. But then when you split it into the two different tax bases that education or that the legislature has authorized, you can really see where your levy is falling. So, and this really is the burden too. So you can see the resident. When you just think of the residents in your district, they're making up 33% of the value in your district, but they're actually carrying more of the burden on the referendum market value component because the ag land is no longer on there. That net tax capacity then, when you bring everybody else on and you shift throughout the different property types based on the classification rate, for instance, a $100,000 business will pay more than a $100,000 home. You'll see that shift. So residential homes pay less, commercial industrial picks up a portion, and then of course you have the qualifying ag coming back into play. So for Marshall in particular, and this is pretty common across most districts depending on the revenue that you generate, 21% of your total levy is on referendum market value, and then almost 80% is on net tax capacity. So building bonds, LTFM, lots of that is on your net tax capacity tax base. So kind of once we have that basis in place, just a little history for those of you who have been around, you have these numbers in your head, and how do we get to the number that we're at today? So in 2003, voters approved $200 per pupil, and that generated a certain amount of revenue based on the number of pupils you had. Then in 2007, you asked for an increase to get you to $675. And then in 2011, you renewed that $675, and the voters approved that in 2011. However, your current allowance today is $0. How do we get there? Couple of things out of your control, mostly, and that was the legislative changes. So the first change that occurred was the calculation of how pupil units were calculated. So it used to be on RMCPUs, I think is what it was called, so residents, and then they switched to actually kids in the seat. And so what the legislature did when they made that change was say, okay, you generated a certain amount of revenue last year based on the number of kids you had. We're going to make sure, based on our changes, that you receive the same amount of revenue next year, and that means your amount per pupil was going to change because they were using a different pupil count. So that's how we got to 7/12/19 after those pupil unit changes. Then, in a couple of different years, the legislature, first it was through board approved and a component on local optional revenue, but throughout those changes generated $724 that the board approves as part of their budget. But if you get it on the through the LOR side, it's a subtraction off your voter approved, so you cannot have both. So that's how you got to a zero balance, essentially, on your voter approved referendum, is because you shifted your voter approved authority over to just an LOR component. And that was the restriction that the legislature said was, if you're going to take this, it's not going to be additive. If you already have, if you already had authority in place. If for those districts that didn't have authority in place, they could add those components. Any questions there on how we got to those numbers? All right, just a couple of then slides on the referendum trends. So as you're considering generating some additional dollars from your voters, it's not out of the ordinary. Most districts are doing this for a variety of reasons. 72% of districts have a voter-approved operating referendum authority, and that number has increased over time. The average is $850 per pupil, and that equates to about 12% of that general education formula allowance, which the number is in 23, 6,863. Almost 7,000, let's just say. So one of the reasons that districts go to their voters for some additional revenue is because that formula allowance in statute is not keeping pace with inflation. So that formula allowance is decided each year by the legislature to change it, or in the case this year, not to change it, this legislative session. So it is not necessarily linked at all to the inflationary pressures you're feeling within your budget. It is a number that they back into and hard code it into statute. Had that number kept up with inflation, we would see about, I think, almost $800 more per pupil, relative to 2003. And that's the difference there between those two charts. So arguably, I think a lot of districts are going to their voters for operating authority to just close that gap between inflation. And, it hasn't been super impactful over the past decade, but it builds over time, right? And you're slowly losing that that growth that inflation has provided over time. Other reasons besides just inflation that school boards are finding themselves going to voters for referendum authority is because of special education, which is not predictable at all each year, but it is a required cost that the state monitors that you're maintaining your effort each year, and the federal government requires that you maintain a certain effort for those programs. So that's another pressure point that districts are feeling, certainly within their budgets. So as you consider the possibility of going to voters for an election, you are restricted to that November timeline. So for building bonds, and I think the last time you went for a building bond, you weren't restricted to those 5 dates. You could go kind of any time as long as it wasn't 2 days away from another election. But since that time, they've restricted building bonds to just 5 times a year in February, April, May, August, and November. But the limitation on operating referendums is just to go in November on the, I guess, premise that your whole community will know about this, right? There's certainly more publicity about November elections. However, I did get to a vote in my community, which was the largest vote of its size, 326 million in White Bear Lake for, and somebody walked out and said, I don't know, I didn't see it. And they didn't turn over the page, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on in November. So there's sort of a balance on, yes, elections are all in the news right then, but school districts fall to the last page, even if it's 326 million.
Is a non-marked vote considered a no vote?
No,
Okay.
it's just an unmarked. Yep. So historically, odd number years, or years in which there is no statewide election, have a greater rate for schools, and that partly is just because it's not clouded by the other larger discussions going on at the time. But over the past 25 years, there's been quite a bit of success with those elections. And like I had mentioned earlier, the renewals, once you get to that point, have a very high success rate. And I'll just mention here that I don't think I mentioned it early on when we were kind of defining the scope of an operating referendum, is you can include inflation on your operating referendum authority. And again, it's, for decades, it wasn't any more than 2% or, $6 on an average authority or something. But over time, then you can renew that higher amount 10 years later on a straight renewal. So it is a component that many districts are going to as part of their considerations on an operating referendum. So here's a graphic of the election trends, just demonstrating that years with no statewide election have a higher approval rate than otherwise. But it's certainly the case, at least recently, that any year, the message is getting out there from schools that, and there is a high success rate in any of those years. So just going forward, that overall election timeline, you can't just decide in November that you're going to call an election. So you have to do that 74 days in advance, and that date is August 26th. There needs to be set in motion a series of things that need to happen with the county auditor, and certainly your efforts as a school board and school district to inform your voters, and enough time needs to happen for that. The benefit, I would say, of going at a November election, whether it be for an operating referendum, which it has to go in November, or a building bond, is that the county is already going. And so you're just tacking on your question, and it's no additional administrative dollars coming from the district. Whereas if you were to go, for instance, for a bond in May, you may be the only thing on the ballot, and you'll be covering the full election costs. So that is the benefit, especially as you're looking to generate operating dollars to not have to pay for that component of the election. So we have explored three options with Dion and Jeremy about for an operating referendum. And again, the way you generate operating revenue is an amount per pupil. And I had mentioned that Marshall receives or qualifies for some aid, and there's two tiers. So the first tier goes up to $460 per pupil, and that has a certain equalization component. And so you can see going across, you're not generating any more aid after you exceed $460 per pupil. That equalization aid is a formula based on your wealth per pupil in your district. And that, again, like the formula allowance, is set in statute. And so you can, as communities grow in value, you tend to lose more aid. However, if you have an addition to a commercial business, or if you have a couple more homes in town, then you will essentially share that loss in aid with those new taxpayers. So then what we do then is take that estimated increase in the levy, spread it over your referendum market value tax base, generating that increase in your taxes in that first year that the vote is approved. I think the other thing to note here is there is a formula called the equity formula, so that what the state does is look to the amount of revenue you're able to generate from your local community, and they'll offset some of their equity formula. It's relatively small, but we just want to make sure that as you're budgeting and you're ensuring that you're budgeting for that net of referendum and equity revenue. So that is included there in that net increase in total revenue line. As I'd mentioned before, there is some variation in the net tax capacity when you're looking at, for instance, a building bond, that $100,000 business will pay twice as much as a $100,000 home. That is not the case for operating referendum. It is, everyone is seen as equal. So a $100,000 business will pay the same as a $100,000 residence, or apartment valued at $100,000, not to be confused with rentals that don't actually pay the property tax itself. That's for the owner of the apartments. So that, any questions on this tax impact? All right, so just the next couple of things that we'd just like to highlight, especially now because the property tax refund is due mid-August. Anytime you are talking to your community about any property tax increases or property taxes in general, we just like to notify everyone that there is property tax refunds in place. You do have to apply, or homeowners do have to apply for them. But they are found on the Department of Revenue website. I did bring a couple of forms right now, so you can fill out the M1 PR for the special property tax refund, which is not income tested, but applies to anyone who has experienced an increase of $100 or more in 1 year. The regular property tax refund, which is income tested, meaning that you have to kind of fit in the formula of how much taxes you have versus your income, household income each year, but you can apply for that every year and get a refund based on that. And then also the rental credit. So renters do pay a portion of their rent. Presumably, a portion of that goes to the landlord's property tax payments, so they are eligible for a certain portion of a refund based on a formula that's decided at the state level. So that all can be found on the M1 PR, which is on the revenue website. Senior citizens can also get a property tax deferral. This is a relatively new program that has been used now. It just says that when there's certain thresholds in place as well, but you can apply to have a portion of your property taxes deferred until you sell your home or pass away, at which point then it's like a loan from the state and paid back. So all those programs that are underutilized at the state level is just helpful information for school boards to share at this time. So that is it.
Well, you said the limit was $1,900 and some dollars. Does that include the 724 LOR, or
Nope.
is that on top of?
That is on top. The 724 now is just part of your, it's called LOR revenue, or local optional revenue. That's completely separate from, there was a series of deductions taken off that maximum at the time they rolled the 724 off voters. So that has been adjusted, I guess, over time to recognize the fact that districts can generate 724 without going to voters.
Any other questions, board members? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Drive safely.
Move on to our consent agenda. Motion to approve it. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, please vote. It is approved. Financials, motion to approve for discussion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Open for discussion.
Yeah, I just had a couple of things I wanted to point out. Food service, if you remember, last month was a zero amount. We had 2 payments in this month for April and May. And then there were just a few things I wanted to point out in the bills. We've got one bill to SMSU for a little over $159,000. That's part of our track lease agreement. We'll have one more payment next year, and then that agreement is fulfilled. We are working on another facility agreement with SMSU at this time. And then another one for SMSU for $6,100 is the rent for ABE. CDW for $162,000. That's part of our one-to-one devices. And then just a few of our construction. We've got Bisbee's was part of the IEQ project at Parkside and Middle School. Amaret Electric, you'll see one for $32,000. That's part of our LTFM retro light fix, which they're doing right now at the middle school. And then another one I just wanted to point out was Coordinated Business Systems. That is the company that took over our Bennett, our print company. Just wanted, it's a new name out there. So that's previously was Bennett Print Services. So you'll see that one come up periodically.
David, any questions for Dion? Hearing none, please vote. It is approved. Anything else on financials?
Yeah, just as we wind down the fiscal year, the revenue and expenditures, our revenue has caught up a little bit. We received a tax payment in May, which was recorded. So right now, if you look at our general fund net, we're actually showing a positive, but I would take caution because we had our payroll on 6/15, which was a little over $2 million.
Thank you. Board forum, board members, anything to bring up?
I had the Murray Lyon County Families Collaborative meeting last Wednesday, and they approved an additional $4,000 for the school district appropriations for this coming year to $39,900. And according to Dion, we use that to help defray costs for counselor and nursing services.
It's good news. The Executive Governance Committee just met earlier today. Mr. Williams shared the draft of a school board handbook. The handbook includes the district's history, roadmap, standards for leadership, and provides framework on expectations, functions, and obligations of the school board. That'll be emailed out to you guys tomorrow to look at. If you have any questions, please contact Mr. Williams. We also discussed, a discussion was held about potentials of work sessions for this coming school year. Proposal is to hold a work session every other month after the 4 o'clock meeting. The work session would be a deeper dive into the information shared during the board presentation. This would be time for the board members to brainstorm and ask more questions in depth. Committee thought that this would be worth trying to see if it works. It'll open up more discussion.
It coincides with our discussion regarding a strategic plan.
Absolutely, yep. Anybody else have anything they'd like to highlight? Okay. Moving on to our administrative reports.
All right, number of things to share this month with you. First of all, my report, you guys are aware that Tricia has submitted her resignation, so this is her last board meeting with us. Her leadership and vision to help us continue to improve Marshall Public Schools has really moved us forward in many ways. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize her publicly and wish her all the best as she pursues this new chapter in her story.
Thank you, Tricia.
Before he moves on, I want to say thank you to you guys. I have the opportunity to work with a lot of colleagues across the state of Minnesota and get to hear their stories about school boards and governance. And I truly do believe in Marshall, Minnesota, we have the best school board in the state. You always take into consideration what is best for our students. And not everybody sees that or may understand the process behind that, but I do. And I just want to say thank you for doing that. For nearly 20 years, I've had the opportunity to witness that. And I feel very blessed to have learned from you guys, so thank you for allowing me the opportunity.
Thank you.
Along those lines, we have hired Emily Rupert. She is here with us this evening to get to kind of watch through a board meeting, and Emily will be joining us at the next one where she'll be helping take the notes and everything and run the PowerPoint. So she's going to learn well and she'll be in charge.
And she's one of our own, as Tricia was.
One of our own coming back to join us. So we're excited to have Emily join our team. Next thing I wanted to share with you is a bulk of the strategic planning work has been completed. The work began with developing our new district strategic roadmap that lays out mission, vision, core values, and strategic directions. That core work centered around a 3-year operational plan that we first developed at the planning team level and then refined at the district level and finally broke down to site and department operational plans that form the focus areas and guide action steps that become the new site improvement plans. So at our admin retreat a week ago, we worked on those. Sites and departments have started laying some things out there, and I should have that strategic plan to bring to the board probably at the July meeting for approval of the plan going forward there. Early childhood, Tiffany shares in her report this month that ESSER funding is helping us provide some free early childhood programming to families this summer. We used to offer some early childhood programming, and that was something we haven't done the last few years, but I'm excited to be able to do that again this year. We have classes for students birth through incoming kindergartners that include parents. Program is taking place primarily at Parkside High School, but there are 2 classes that are taking place at parks in the community as well to offer more variety and opportunities to families that are interested in those classes. Parkside, Darcy shares that with all the building projects completed, we are hosting summer school again this year at Parkside. Fun to see the excitement in students' faces as they return after a 1-week break. She commented it was as if they had never left the building. So custodians are busy cleaning areas as they're available, kind of working around the summer school programming. We also have a couple of breaks scheduled over the summer to get things cleaned up and ready for another fabulous year at Parkside starting this fall. Southview, Pete shares that they are continuing to support staff in learning and implementing the science of reading and core reading classes. So he's had some trainings that have taken place this summer. He also shares that math teachers had virtual training through BER. It's a training company that they work with. This summer, they're doing some of those things, creating pre and post assessments, measuring student attainment of benchmarks, as well as focusing on talking students through their own growth mindset. So a lot of good work going there that will affect our plans going forward this fall. Middle school, Paula shared that they had 107 students participate in the Minnesota Maud Hart Loveless Reading Challenge this year. Big thank you goes out to all of the reading participants, the staff, and the parents who supported the readers through this year's challenge. She also shared that they had a day designated at the end of the year to celebrating culture, where students had asked about doing this. They implemented it for the building. Students could wear cultural clothing representative of their backgrounds. They had a really good participation in that opportunity, and there were big smiles, and kids were really proud to be able to do that at school this year. So that was a fun event this spring. High school shares that the 2022 Pride in the Tiger Senior Scholarship Ceremony was held on May 18th at the high school. 143 scholarships and awards were distributed, totaling over $194,000 to members of the senior class. Big thank you to Krista Biella, the Pride in the Tiger Executive Director, and to Deb Mittling for her work on helping coordinate that event. Maytech report, Amanda shared that Maytech had 11 students graduate in a ceremony that was held on May 27th. Excited for those students and look forward to what comes next in their futures. She also shared that with the summer credit recovery program, we have 100 students enrolled and working on the summer high school credit recovery program. The program is back on site, so full face-to-face again this year, and held at Marshall High School. Students started on Tuesday, January 7th, and they go through July 1st, so we'll wrap up before the 4th of July weekend. Coordinator of special projects, they had some fun things taking place this time around as well. The American Indian Parent Advisory Committee held its spring event on a stormy evening. That May 11th night, we had all the storms going through. They had their big event planned, so the weather did not cooperate. But the event was well received. We had a nice number of people attending that. American Indian artist John Sterner was there. He entertained students with a horse stick art project where students created art and were able to bring that product home with them at the end of the day. She also shares that the K-8 summer school, the targeted services program, began the first session on June 13th at Parkside, where more than 200 students are registered for each session. As part of that program, she shared that the summer school is having different activities take place. They're running like a camp kind of theme. They had someone from Lyon County Extension Office there providing activities this first week. Students used flexible pool noodles and marbles, and they created their very own roller coasters. Students had a lot of fun doing that, and they have other things planned throughout the summer. Every week there's a different project. They're doing paper airplanes, cars, coding, mice, and more. I'm assuming it's not like mice, the animals. I'm not sure. Special ed, Jackie shared this time around about physical therapy and occupational therapy services. There's special ed related services that assist students with motor and or sensory needs that impacts their ability to function at school. One thing that department has been doing this year is really focusing on inclusion on the playground. So making sure students have access to the different pieces on our playgrounds. Currently, the 3 playgrounds at Parkside and both playgrounds at Southview have adaptive equipment that is accessible to students with motor needs. So that really helps with the OT and PT, getting students included with activities taking place in the playgrounds. Director of Teaching and Learning, Beth shares fantastic turnout at CEO kickoff event that was May 23rd. Students and parents were there. They could sign off on their letter of intent for participating in part of that program. Had a lot of excitement. It was really a nice evening, good event for students to kick off the start of that program when they'll start classes this fall. We also have received our preliminary access results. So access is the the EL test that all of our EL students take. We had 45 students meet exit criteria this year. That's up significantly from last year where we had 28 students meet exit criteria. High number of students meeting that criteria this year is a direct reflection of all the hard work and dedication that our classroom teachers and EL teachers have put in this year, and being back face-to-face was really a big part of that too. So appreciate all the hard work to ensure the students' needs are being met. Finally, Beth shared that as a district, we met our district-wide goal at 92% this year. So of all the reading and math goals we had, based on meeting norm writ on math and reading, as well as meeting growth targets, goals within both math and reading again. It's up from the 21-22 school year where we had 83% of the goals met, so almost 10% increase. really makes a difference being face-to-face, in-person learning for the whole year this year. Time and dedication, again, for staff members is really appreciated as their work paid off with final goal results this year. So thank you to all those people.
Just some updates. Food service, wanted to just, I attached the poster for the free food, breakfast and lunch times and locations. Hopefully that'll get out to the community. We've had some good numbers so far the first couple of weeks. As we discussed during the budget meeting or budget presentation last week, that as of right now, the meals will return to paid meals, kind of back to normal that it was back in 2019, 2020. And we decided to not bring to the board a recommendation for any increase in those meals since our fund balance is doing well in food service. Negotiations, all individual and group negotiations have been settled. Thanks for approving the last two on this meeting. We have one left, the principals group, which we haven't met with yet. Jeremy and I wanted to give an update on the Marshall Community Technical Institute. There are some things going, still moving, even though we don't see construction going on. Just wanted to make sure the board and the community know that we're working on the revised plans, revised dollar amounts. We'll be working, once we get the revised plans done, we'll be working with Glad Home Bisbees and Meyer Electric, who won the bids, to show them the revised plans and continue to work on some of those revised costs. We do have to then submit the plans to the state, which could take 30 to 60 days. Sounds like they're pretty backlogged right now. But again, if you don't see a lot of construction going on out there, we are doing some things to get that in motion. I wanted to take a time just to thank Reinhardt Food Service and Carlson Stewart. We had one of our freezers at Southview had gone down due to one of the controls, one of the parts, and Reinhardt brought one of their refrigerated trailers out to use. We had no loss of product, and Reinhardt donated that trailer to us to use over the weekend. Tom Bloomey did a great job making sure all the food was transported back and forth, and Carlson Stewart came out and had it fixed within a couple of days. So pretty awesome. We have those local vendors. Southview, I just put some of the punch list items we'll be working on. If you've drove by the last couple of days, you'll see there's some curb sidewalk work being done as we need to make sure that the proper drainage according to the specs of the plan were done. LVT will be done in the cafeteria and some various other areas as it wasn't installed correctly, so the contractor is redoing that in early August. And then Trish, I don't know if you can just pop mine up, but put a list of the LTFM projects. And we won't go through every single one, but I think it's important, and we share these with the buildings too, to show how many different projects that we're doing. We don't just do them all in the summer, but a majority of them are done. So that's a list of the ones we'll try to accomplish in the summer of 2022. Then if you scroll down a little further, I think we've got the 2023 in the next 5 years. What we're going to accomplish. I know a lot of people talk about what about the theater, what about some of these other projects. Those are some of them that will be coming up in the next year or two. And then at the next board meeting is when we'll present the 10-year expenditure and revenue plan to the board to approve that we do every year. If you could scroll down just a little more, please.
Where did you find that picture at the bottom?
I don't want to scare Emily. I was very young and innocent, and I didn't want her to, know what she'll look like in 20 years.
Wow.
Don't be scared.
How old were you then?
Probably 24.
Go back. I didn't get to see it
It's
too.
in your.
Is it okay?
It's in our back.
All right, good. Look good in the newspaper.
Jeff, I just had a comment too, and piggyback off of Deion's report. Gotten a lot of comments last couple weeks about what Southview looks like with all the weeds and stuff. That's not a school district lack of maintenance right now. That's waiting for contractors to do some of that punch list work. So hopefully those contractors get that stuff done because it's a beautiful school. We'd like to be able to have it all look that way. So.
Yep.
Just to elaborate on that a little bit, we did have a meeting a week and a half ago with 3 of the contractors that have to do with the grading, the landscaping, and the general contractor, along with our architect, ICS, and BAA, because we thought it was very important that we get out there. We're not very happy with the timing. Spring was a good spring. We had a good spring. We had a nice, cool spring with rain that would have been great to have that grass down and taken care of. But as Bill had said, the school district, there are certain things that we can't do because we'll void the warranty. So going out there and trying to take care of the weeds and mowing is something that we need to leave up to the contractors to do, as bad as it looks right now. But we are constantly keeping on them to get that done.
Very good. Thank you. Discussion items, election timelines for 2022. Were there any comments or questions?
Just wanted to share with that we do have 3 board positions that are going to be up for election for this fall, so we want to get this timeline in front of people. One thing I want to share is that on July 27th at 4:30 in the afternoon, we're holding a board member informational session. It'll be here in the PD room, where anyone who's considering running for one of those open board seats can learn more information about what it means to be a school board member and that sort of thing. So we look forward to that. And then the dates posted kind of walk through everything. I'm not going to go through all of those. I just want to highlight the candidate filing period. That's open August 2nd through August 16th for this fall. So anyone who's going to run for school board would need to file for that between August 2nd and the 16th.
Very good. Discussion items. This will be the first reading of policies 201 through 205. Anybody have any questions on any of those policies? Moving on to our action items, approval of the 2022-23 budget. Motion to approve. Need a second.
I'll second.
Is open for discussion.
This is just the approval or the recommendation for the approval of the budget that was presented at the last board meeting. Numbers are the same that were presented.
Any questions? Hearing none, please vote. Is approved. Approval of the 2022-23 literacy plan. Motion to approve. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion?
Share this is our annual plan that reviews how we approach literacy instruction in the district, and our elementary principals and reading specialists have put a lot of work into this plan. Main change this year is this reflects the work we're doing with science of reading, with really that phonics focus that we're bringing in with the K through 4 in particular.
Very good. Please vote. It is approved. Approval of the Marshall Public Schools equity statement. Motion to,
I'd
go
like
ahead.
to, do I amend it or?
No. you
Not
can
yet.
just- You can just, I make a motion to revise.
Okay.
to give them-
Okay. I'll make a motion to approve the revised version of it.
Okay. I'll second that. Open for discussion.
If you guys haven't seen it yet, I just made a recommendation. The very last sentence of the statement said, ensure equitable outcomes, which I don't know how we would ever be able to ensure equitable outcomes. So we just changed it to equitable access.
That makes sense,
That makes
Matt.
sense.
Does that,
I think that's great.
That was actually a suggestion Matt had made at the last board meeting, and when I sent your board packets out, I had failed to make that correction in the statement that was sent out. So
So this is approval with that correction.
and both are posted if you want to look at both.
So the recommendation now reads that the board approves the revised equity statement as presented. And the revised one is attached in the board packet.
Very good. Any other questions, comments? We'll vote. It is approved. Thank you, board members. Meeting's adjourned.